The rain fell relentlessly that evening, thin, silvery threads cascading down the glass towers of the city, washing the streets in shimmering reflections. Inside a sleek black limousine idling near a small diner, Alexander Reed, the CEO of Reed Holdings, sat alone, watching raindrops race each other down the window. He was a man who had everything: money, power, prestige, yet there was a hollowness in his chest that no boardroom victory could fill. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him and his heart stranded in a silence that success could never drown out. His driver, an older man named David, glanced in the rearview mirror. "Sir, we'll be late for the gala. Should I continue?" Alexander shook his head. "No, just give me a minute." David nodded silently. The boss's voice, usually sharp and decisive, carried something different tonight, a quiet ache. Alexander leaned back, unbuttoning his collar, his reflection staring back at him from the tinted window, a man of power but no peace. Then, through the blur of rain, something small moved. A figure. A knock echoed against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Alexander looked up, startled. A little girl stood there, drenched from head to toe, clutching a broken umbrella. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her big brown eyes blinked against the rain, but her expression was determined. David began to roll down the window, but Alexander stopped him. He did it himself. "Greater than, what are you doing out here?" Alexander asked, his voice softer than he expected. "Greater than, please, sir," the girl said, her voice trembling but brave. "My mom, she's sick. She fell down inside the diner. I don't know what to do." Alexander's heart skipped. "Where's your father?" She hesitated, looking down. I don't have one." That answer hit him harder than it should have. Without another word, Alexander pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. David protested, but he ignored him. The icy drops soaked his expensive suit instantly, but he didn't care. Inside the diner, the scene was chaotic. A woman lay unconscious beside a booth, her arm limp, a spilled cup of coffee staining the floor. A waitress was kneeling beside her, trying to revive her, panic in her eyes. "Greater than, call an ambulance," Alexander ordered, his voice firm yet calm. He shrugged off his jacket and knelt, gently lifting the woman's head and resting it on his coat. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow. The girl, the same one from the rain, clung to his sleeve, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Greater than, please don't let her die," she whispered, her tiny voice cracking. Alexander looked at her and felt something stir in him, something long buried. He reached out, holding her trembling hand. "Greater than, I promise, I won't," he said softly. Moments later, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. The paramedics rushed in, working quickly to lift the woman onto a stretcher. Alexander stayed close, his arm around the girl to keep her steady. "Greater than, she's suffering from exhaustion and dehydration," one of the medics said. "We'll take her to St. Mary's." "Greater than, I'll follow," Alexander replied instantly. The girl looked up at him, confused. "You don't even know us." He knelt down, meeting her eyes. "You asked for help. That's enough." Hours later, under the sterile lights of St. Mary's Hospital, Alexander sat in the waiting area with the little girl beside him. Her damp clothes had been replaced with a hospital blanket, her hair still dripping. She stared at him curiously, a man in an expensive suit, sitting beside her on a plastic chair like any ordinary person. "Greater than, thank you," she said softly. Alexander smiled faintly. "What's your name?" "Greater than, Lila," she replied. "And my mom's name is Grace." He nodded slowly. "She'll be okay, Lila. You were very brave tonight." She looked down at her hands, fidgeting. "I didn't know what to do. You just looked kind." That word, kind, hit him like lightning. No one had called him that in years. Silence filled the air until Lila tilted her head and whispered something that froze him in place. "Greater than, you need a wife," she said matter-of-factly, "and I need a dad." Alexander blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "What did you say?" Lila looked up at him with innocent conviction. "You look lonely. My mom says lonely people need someone to make them smile again. You need someone. We both do." He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For the first time in years, his chest felt something more than emptiness, a spark. Just then, a nurse approached. "Mr. Reed, Ms. Grace is awake. She's asking for her daughter." Lila's face lit up. "Mommy." Alexander followed as she ran down the hallway. Grace lay in a hospital bed, pale but awake, her eyes soft with gratitude as she saw her little girl safe. Lila leapt into her arms. Standing at the doorway, Alexander watched quietly, his heart heavy yet warm. The rain still fell outside, but inside that small hospital room, something had shifted. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed, the man with everything, felt the stirring of something he'd lost long ago, hope. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital blinds, washing the sterile room in gentle gold. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor blended with the distant murmur of nurses' footsteps. Grace, pale but awake, lay propped against her pillows, her frail hands resting over her daughter's small fingers. Across the room sat Alexander Reed, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in his hands. He had barely slept. Instead, he spent the night watching over Grace and her daughter, feeling an inexplicable sense of responsibility. Grace's eyes fluttered open again. She blinked, confused at first, until she saw him sitting there. "You're still here?" she asked softly. Alexander smiled faintly. "I don't usually walk away from people who need help." She gave a weak laugh. "That's what everyone says until they actually have to stay." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at his coffee, the words hitting a little too close to home. Lila, curled up in a chair beside her mother, yawned and looked up sleepily. "Mommy, he stayed all night. I told you he was nice." Grace glanced between her daughter and the man in the chair. "You really didn't have to." "Greater than, I wanted to," Alexander interrupted gently. She was scared. "And, to be honest, I didn't want to leave." Grace studied him for a moment. His expensive watch, his commanding presence, and the quiet weight in his eyes, he wasn't just any man. There was something different about him, something both intimidating and kind. "Greater than, you're not a regular customer, are you?" she asked with a small smirk. He chuckled. "No, I suppose I'm not. I'm Alexander Reed." Her smile faded. "Reed Holdings, the Alexander Reed." He nodded, modestly. "That's me. But right now, I'd rather just be Alex, the man who got caught in the rain." Grace blinked in disbelief. The man who had helped her, who had stayed overnight, was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. "Greater than, why would someone like you bother with someone like me?" she whispered. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but sincere. "Because last night, when I saw Lila in the rain, I didn't see a waitress and her daughter. I saw two people trying to survive. And I remembered what that felt like." Grace's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She wasn't used to compassion, especially not from men like him. Lila giggled suddenly, breaking the silence. "Mommy, he doesn't even know how to smile properly." "Look." Alexander turned to her, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" The little girl grinned, pointing at his face. "When you smile, your eyes don't join in. It's like your mouth forgot to tell them." Grace laughed, a sound like sunlight after a storm. Even Alexander couldn't help it. A real, warm laugh escaped him for the first time in years. "You're quite the critic," he said. "Greater than, I just tell the truth," Lila replied proudly. The nurse came in soon after with discharge papers. "You're free to go, Ms. Grace. But please, take it easy. You fainted from exhaustion and low blood sugar." Grace nodded weakly, glancing at her worn handbag on the table. Inside was barely enough to pay the hospital bill. She hesitated, biting her lip. Alexander noticed. "Don't," he said gently. "I'll handle it." Her head snapped up. "I can't let you do that." "Greater than, you're not letting me," he interrupted. "I want to." Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Grace finally nodded, tears threatening to spill. "Thank you," she whispered. Later, as they left the hospital, the sunlight had broken through the clouds. Lila skipped ahead, humming, while Alexander and Grace walked side by side. "Greater than, you really didn't have to pay for everything," she said quietly. "We'll find a way to pay you back." He smiled softly. "Maybe you can. Let me buy you both dinner, as a start." She laughed under her breath. "Dinner? Are you always this persistent?" "Greater than, only when I meet someone who reminds me what real people look like," he said. Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't reply. That evening, they sat in a small family diner, not the kind Alexander was used to, but one that smelled of cinnamon and laughter. Lila devoured a slice of pie while Grace watched her daughter, the light returning to her tired eyes. "Greater than, you're good with her," Grace said quietly. "Greater than, I wasn't sure I remembered how to be," Alexander admitted. "But she makes it easy." Lila leaned over, smiling up at him. "See, Mommy, I told you he just needed someone to make him smile for real." Grace looked at him, this man who had walked into their lives out of nowhere, and for the first time, she didn't feel afraid of what tomorrow might bring. And Alexander, as he watched Grace and Lila laugh together under the golden diner lights, he realized something he hadn't in years. Maybe the family he thought he lost wasn't gone, it had just been waiting for him to find it again. A few weeks passed since that rainy night. The seasons had begun to turn, trading the chill of early spring for soft sunlight and blooming streets. Life, in its quiet way, had begun to change for Alexander Reed, the man who once thought he had everything, except peace. He still ran his billion-dollar empire, attended board meetings, and signed contracts worth millions, but something in him had shifted. He smiled more often, he didn't rush through conversations. His assistant, Maya, noticed first. "Sir, you've been different lately," she said one morning. "More patient, almost human." Alexander chuckled. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "From me." "Absolutely," she teased. "Does this have anything to do with the waitress and her daughter?" He paused, a rare softness flickering in his eyes. "Maybe." On Saturday, Alexander found himself standing outside a small neighborhood bakery. Through the glass, he could see Grace, laughing as she served pastries to customers. Her apron was dusted with flour, her hair tied back messily, and yet she looked more radiant than any woman at his corporate galas. And beside the counter, drawing with crayons, was Lila, her laughter ringing like bells. When she spotted him through the window, her eyes widened. "Mommy, he's here." Grace looked up, startled but smiling. "Mr. Reed, I didn't think billionaires shopped for cupcakes." "Only when they're this good," he said, holding up a small box. "And please, just Alex." Grace wiped her hands and joined him. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I didn't have to," he said gently. "I wanted to." They shared a moment of silence before Lila ran up, holding out a drawing. "Look, it's us." The picture showed 3 stick figures. One tall man, one woman, and a little girl holding their hands. Above them, in bright purple crayon, were the words, "Ma family." Grace's breath caught. "Lila, I just drew what I feel," Lila said simply, smiling at Alexander. "You make Mommy smile, and you don't look so lonely anymore." Alexander swallowed hard. "You're quite the artist," he said softly, taking the drawing carefully as though it were something sacred. Grace's cheeks warmed. "I'm sorry." She doesn't always filter what she says. "Don't apologize," he replied. "She just says what most of us are too afraid to admit." Over the next few weeks, Alexander visited more often. Sometimes he brought flowers for Grace's counter. Sometimes he helped Lila with homework while her mother worked late. He found peace in their small world, a kind of warmth money could never buy. But not everyone approved. One afternoon, as he left the bakery, a black sedan pulled up. His company's board member, and longtime rival, Richard Harlow stepped out. "You've been hard to reach lately, Alex," Richard said coldly. "Too busy playing house." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "Investors are talking. They don't like this distraction. That waitress doesn't fit your image. You have responsibilities." Alexander's eyes darkened. "My image stopped mattering the day I met people who saw me as more than a CEO." Richard smirked. "Careful, Alex. Feelings make men weak." "No," Alexander said quietly. "They make men real." He walked away, leaving Richard glaring after him. That evening, Grace found Alexander sitting alone in the park, staring at the crayon drawing Lila had made. "Rough day?" she asked gently. He smiled faintly. "You could say that. My company thinks you're a bad influence." She frowned. "Then maybe you should listen to them. You don't need us complicating your life." "Grace," he said, standing up. "Before I met you, I had everything money could buy, and nothing that mattered. You and Lila reminded me what being alive feels like." Tears welled in her eyes. "Alex, I don't belong in your world." "Then I'll leave mine behind," he said, voice breaking slightly. "I'd trade every deal I've made for one more day like this." For a moment, she said nothing. The breeze carried Lila's laughter from the playground nearby. Grace finally stepped closer and whispered, "You don't have to trade anything. You just have to stay." He looked at her, eyes glistening. "I'm not going anywhere." And when Lila ran up and wrapped her little arms around both of them, whispering, "See. I told you we'd fit. It felt like destiny had finally kept its promise. Weeks later, a newspaper headline appeared. Alexander Reed steps down as CEO, opens foundation for single parents. In the photo beneath, Alexander stood beside Grace and Lila, smiling genuinely for the first time in years. The caption read, "Greater than, sometimes, family finds you when you least expect it." And for Alexander, that was the only deal that ever truly mattered.